Thank you, Matteo. I'll begin to introduce. Dr. Pravir Malik has been developing a unified theory and mathematics of organization over the last 3 decades. He has written 17 books emphasizing a whole systems approach, integrating individual, organizational, economic, social, environmental, and evolutionary dimensions. In recent years, he's been involved with computer modeling of complex organizational, economic, and world systems to help stakeholders navigate and understand possible futures. Dr. Malik holds leadership positions as Chief Strategy Officer at Galaxies, focused on modeling of complex realities, and Chief Technologist at Deep Order Technologies, where he is spearheading the development of a revolutionary atom-based quantum computer. His recent writings propose alternative trajectories of development for quantum computing, artificial intelligence, genetics, and transhumanism to increase the likelihood of sustainable global development. He has a PhD in technical management with a focus on mathematics of innovation and complex adaptive systems, an MBA from Northwestern University's J.L. Kellogg Graduate School of Management, and an MS in computer science with a focus on AI. Many of us know Pravir from workshops and presentations on Savitri and light and cosmology. I know Pravir because I've collaborated with him on visuals for Musings on Light and on a new book called The Mythology of the Cosmology of Light. The insights of the cosmology of light and integral yoga open new ways of understanding of the relationship of consciousness and matter. Pravir will help us explore how we can more fully collaborate in the evolution of possibilities. I'm honored to introduce Dr. Pravir Malik.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. Okay, great, okay. Thank you, Margaret, so much for that lovely introduction. And thank you, Matteo, Linda, and Jonathan for inviting me to speak. It truly is a privilege to present my thoughts. And just for clarification, what I'm going to present today is a practical approach to leveraging the powers within to build organizations of the future. There'll be elements of cosmology of light, but it's not, cosmology of light is not foundational to this. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint presentation that I'd like to step through. And let's see. I'm going to switch to full screen mode. So reality check, you can see this, right? So, okay, great.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, so this, I want to begin by just saying that there's various components that have organically arisen in the path of my life that are instrumental in suggesting a practical approach to creating the organization of the future. Now, over the last 30 years, I've, in a sense, interacted with life in a way that just happened naturally. And I began with an interaction to understand what I'd call a systems canvas. And that went on to an understanding of how do you manage that systems canvas. And so I leveraged emotional intelligence, and I'll share more about that. And that really transitions. So once you have that management of this canvas, then there's a possibility of something deeper arising. And so that leads us into tapping into deeper possibilities through powers within. But there's always the trick of keeping things vitally alive. You know, even if one begins to shift towards something that's aspirational, you know, how do you practically keep things going? And so I'll speak a little bit about that. And more recently, I would say in the last 5 to 6 years, I've used light as a mechanism to also manage some of the problems that have arisen. And so I'll share a little bit about what that looks like practically. And then a final component has been a mathematical modeling of future enterprise. And this becomes important because to the degree that we can create tools that actually give us insight into the system canvas and into how we're managing it and to what degree we're leveraging powers within and so on, we have something potentially more powerful at our fingertips with which to begin to practically approach the organization of the future. So I'm going to share some stories as I go through this because it's been an organic journey and it's not something I planned, but essentially these are the chapters that I've been through over the last 30 years pretty organically. But to summarize where I'm going to take us over the next 45 minutes to 50 minutes is essentially, again, speak about or introduce the thinking around how to create a systems canvas that can model reality in such a way that these surprising elements of reality, the organicness of reality, is not lost in that modeling. I'll speak about managing at the margin. So the question is, it's very easy when one is in a system to become subject to the system and to use our biases or to use particular ways of seeing the system as per how we prefer to see it and lose track of what really the system is trying to tell us. So the question of managing at the margin becomes very important. And as I mentioned, to the degree that we can do that, there's going to be something else that arises that will reconfigure what the possibilities are in the system. And I'll go over practically I work for a couple of organizations that I'll call kind of like Robin Hood organizations in the sense that they use money to really enable communities and so on. And so it's been a pleasure to work for them. But I'll share how I help them really keep the vital flows alive, even as we began to shift some things practically. And then essentially introduce some aspects of cosmology of light. And here, of course, I've, as Margaret mentioned, we've worked together on a couple of books. And before that, I've written 10 books on the cosmology of light, where I've tried to embody the mathematical power in light. And it's theoretical, but when one uses light practically, then the theory becomes practice. I want to share something of how that looks. So, starting with developing a systems canvas, and I've got to watch the time as well because, so we have I think another 45 minutes. So, I start with the story here. And this was in the mid 90s. I used to be a software engineer. That's what my training was in the 80s. So I had a very kind of structured way to look at things. And I expected that the world would work like a program, in the sense that in a program, if you put a set of instructions together, you know what's going to be the output. And all of a sudden, when I transitioned from being an engineer to entering into the management world, I found that didn't work anymore. And particularly the story that comes back to me very strongly is I used to work for a global consulting company. It was called A.T. Kearney. And they had about 70 offices around the world. So I had just finished my MBA. I had joined them. So I was very, very junior in the organization, at just about the bottom of the hierarchy. But I had this idea of, why don't we open an office in India? Because India, it was kind of the pre-liberalization where the economy began to open out in 1998, and I had this idea in 1996. So I approached the chief operating officer of the company, and I said, hey, why don't we open this office in India? It's a right time to open it. And he just kind of ignored me for a little bit. And he says, yeah, we're thinking about it. But I didn't give up. And then after another 2 months, I prepared a much more elaborate presentation and I sent it to him. And from an engineering perspective, that elaborate presentation that showed the pros and cons and the business case should have been enough. But it still wasn't. But I knew I had his interest because he said, okay, I'm coming. He used to work out of Germany, and he said, I'm coming to Chicago, where the headquarters was and where I used to work. And he says, let's meet up. Now it so happened that somebody told me a little bit about him, that he's a very quote unquote sophisticated guy. He breeds horses, and he loves to dress really, really well. And somehow that part about dressing well kind of entered into me. It's probably the system telling me something. So what I did was, before my meeting, like a couple of weeks before, I went to Nordstrom, and I spent a good percentage of my annual salary to actually buy the best Italian suit and Italian shoes I could find. And then when I met him, I dressed up, and sure enough, when he looked at me, the first thing his eyes fell on my shoes, and I knew the rest was kind of history, because somehow it clicked, and then he invited me to be part of the India office, and so I ended up being like employee number one of this office. But I was still the junior most person, but there were still a bunch of other people who were there. But this kind of was, for me, a signal of how the system worked differently than how I thought. So it kind of led me into this world of, what are these complex dynamics, and why, when you have something that theoretically is supposed to work the way it doesn't. And this led me into this whole idea of people having different personal heuristics and different perceptions and points of view. And so that led me into, okay, how do I truly understand the system that any organization kind of emanates from? And what I'd like to share before we dive into it is a very nice video. It's 4.5 minutes that captures this idea of systems thinking. I'm not sure if everybody on this call has been introduced to systems thinking, but I'd like to play this and then use it as a basis for the discussion. So let me just start it. And so hopefully you can see it. So.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years, but the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds, of migratory birds, started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
Great. Yeah. So I'd like to share that video because there's many components that are fundamental to thinking about a system canvas. And there's properties that are highlighted in any good modeling of a system canvas that become clear in that video. For example, there's what's called sensitive dependence on initial conditions. If the wolves were not introduced, none of those changes would have happened. And if just the deer had been prevalent, then Yellowstone would have continued down a path of kind of destructive trajectory in a sense. But then also there's a lot of codependence between different species. When the wolf came in, they changed. There was this sense of coevolution between the different species, and even plant species were affected positively. So there's a lot of changes that happened. And I'm going to call attention in a couple of minutes to some specific properties that are fundamental to thinking about a system canvas. But the next question is, so we have a system, and Yellowstone National Park is an example of a system that when you introduce the wolf into it, it began to thrive. So the question is, what kind of system is the most sustainable? Now, research has shown that something called complex adaptive systems is what's most sustainable. And complex means you can't predict what will emerge through the interaction of parts. Just as we couldn't predict on the face of it that the course of rivers are going to change. I mean, that's something that is unexpected unless you've done a very, very deep research of ecosystems and understand that kind of thing. It's adaptive. Any complex adaptive system will adapt to whatever challenges is coming to it. And here, for example, if we think about Yellowstone National Park, then the question is, how adaptive was it? Because in the absence of the wolves, there would have been another trajectory in play where its destruction would have been ensured. So that begs the question of what do we mean by adaptive, and what is a complex adaptive system? And then finally, a system is, of course, anything that contains many independent parts that operate as one entity. Now, through history, the most robust complex adaptive systems have been cities, have been civilizations. And for instance, if we think about a city, there's no one party that usually is in control. If there's problems that occur, then different populations within the city will, if it's a well-operating city, will rise up to address it. So there's different ways in which it operates that makes it a good example of a complex adaptive system. And here what we're trying to do again is just understand what's that ideal system canvas that we want to work with to begin with in thinking about a future enterprise. So now the question is, what is it that drives sustainability of complex adaptive systems? So whether it's a thriving civilization or whether it's a city that's withstood the test of time and remade itself again and again without falling into destructive habits, then what is it that really is driving that sustainability? And from a high level point of view, we can say that there's two factors. There's something that happens when a city grows, whereby economies of scale kick in. And there's also something that happens that drives innovation. So, imagine that you have a system that isn't a complex system. So you double the size. So imagine a city is not a complex system. You increase the population from 1 million to 2 million people. Then you would expect, if there was no scaling advantage, that you would need double the amount of grocery stores to service that population, or you would need double the amount of petrol pumps to service the population. However, if it's a complex system that's working well, in reality, you don't need double, but you need less than double. So you need like a fraction of, you need like say 1.5 times, not 2 times, even though the population is increasing. And then on the flip side, if it's a well-functioning complex adaptive system, a well-functioning city, then you would see that the kind of innovation that happens, so the way that problems are addressed, or the patents per population, or the inventions that become real, that doesn't scale linearly either, but it scales more than linearly. And people have said it's because you have coffee shops and you have restaurants where people come in and out and they meet, and there's all kinds of conversations that weren't thought of, and so on. So ultimately, when you talk about the sustainability of complex adaptive system, it's this differential that really would drive what's responsible for the sustainability of a complex adaptive system. And that's kind of a surface view. The question is, when you look under the hood, what are the complex adaptive systems properties? And as I mentioned, and as we saw in the Yellowstone National Park video, there's no one entity that's in control. It's a distributed control. There's lots of different species. There's animal species, plant species. There's the rivers. There's the interaction. There's a high degree of connectivity. There's coevolution that happens as the behavior of one species changes. It impacts other species. As I mentioned, there's sensitivity to initial conditions. There's non-linearity. You would never expect, for example, on the face of it, that just introducing a relatively small number of wolves would change things so radically. And so when you look under the hood, you kind of get a sense for what is it that you really need the system canvas that you want to put in place to be able to display or mimic. So, and this, I want to point out that literature, research on complex adaptive systems will take what I call a bottom-up point of view. So this is from the inside out, it's a bottom-up. But what the literature doesn't necessarily go into is the top-down point of view, or how things change from the outside in. And here, some of the work I've done that essentially, I was inspired by Savitri, which I used to read a lot. I still read it a lot, but in the 90s, I read it a lot. And there was, if you go through the book of Traveler of the Worlds, for instance, you become aware of many different kinds of patterns that exist in these different physical, vital, mental worlds, and the conditions necessary to change from one pattern to the other. And then even when you manage to transcend this whole physical, vital, mental scale by opening to intuition, and then you, as somebody mentioned yesterday, you conduct or you're subject to a vast surrender so that you let go of everything, then in a sense, you allow a different set of patterns that emanate from the Divine Mother to come in and change the basis of these fundamental patterns that are going to animate the system. And so in the work that I've done, essentially what I've tried to do is create a system canvas. And there's 5 books that I've written that have to do with it, that have all been inspired by parts of Savitri or my interpretation of Savitri. And this has become, in a sense, the practical basis by which the work that I do today is kind of placed. It's trying to understand the system from not only the inside out, as is apparent from that Yellowstone National Park video, but also from the outside in. So, what are time and space patterns? How do these change? What are the conditions for their changing? Altered causality. In Savitri, for instance, we have the clear action of avatars, and then it's hinted that there's also the action of vibhutis through previous incarnations of Ashwapati or of Savitri. So there's different causality that's put into play that allows shifts to happen, and there's additional properties that become kind of relevant to how to think about the system. So this is the first. So in a practical approach, the basis, the foundation is to get a system canvas that can, in a sense, reflect more accurately how the system might be working. We'll never get it completely right, but to the degree that we can model both these top-down and inside-out dynamics, the closer we're going to get to something that would lead us to a more robust enterprise of the future. So this is the basis, and reinforced on that. Now the question is, how do you become sensitive to what's happening in this system canvas? And that's where I would say that managing disorganization through emotional intelligence becomes really important. And I'm going to go back to the scale that I had shown earlier of, you've got the linear scale. If it's a system that's not complex adaptive system, but if it's a complex adaptive system, you've got these advantages of what's called a superlinear scale and a sublinear scale. But as with anything, there's always problems with these superlinear scaling and sublinear scaling. So for example, it's very, and we've probably all seen this happen in organizations, and I've certainly seen a lot of it happen, is that a successful organization becomes subject to its own success. And many times there's groupthink that'll set in. So even though, because it's been very innovative in the past, it thinks that what it's done can never really disturb it, and it's going to continue to do what it's always done. And then it also begins to rely on past laurels, and it becomes much more important to be able to manage this very, very, with a high degree of discrimination. And on the other side, as economies of scale kind of set in and provide that sublinear advantage to the system canvas, what we got to watch for is wasted effort and fragmentation. So many times, again, what I've seen in organizations is that the same thing will be repeated again and again in isolated parts, because the system isn't really talking with each other, and everybody's doing their own thing, and that results in a lot of waste. So again, the question is, how do you practically manage these kinds of things that can essentially destroy the advantage that a complex adaptive system has? And so, here we're all endowed with a very sophisticated mechanism. It's emotional intelligence. It's a radar, whereby we can become aware of what's happening in the system in signals in ourselves. So it might be signals of thought, it might be signals of emotion, by which we can sense many times, how another is feeling, or we get an intuition from something in the system that's not quite right, and it comes up as a kind of a disturbance within us. And if we pay attention to it closely, then we have that equipment to be able to manage with a high degree of discrimination what the system is telling us. And so I, over the years, and this has been through many iterations, I created a tool, an emotional intelligence tool, that essentially is used by teams and organizations. And the first iteration of this was with the Indian Armed Forces. It was used in the 1990s. And then I made changes to it. I made it web-based. It used to be a desktop version, and it got used at Stanford University Medical Center. I'll speak a little bit about that for a few years. And essentially, in this tool, what the driving thing is that you have individuals that are part of a team, and a team can be any size. You can have teams of 10 people or of 25 people or 40 people. But the idea is that everybody enters anonymously what they're feeling about the particular situation or a particular project, but they use their emotion as a way to make an entry. And it so happened that my book, Connecting Inner Power with Global Change, came out about the same time as I began to work at Stanford University Medical Center. And I was also in interaction with the leadership at the Gap. And that created a galvanizing event, because the Gap then sponsored a radio show on connecting inner power with global change, which was a 13-part radio show that went over each chapter in more detail. There was a discussion, but then it was the organizational development group at Stanford University who was kind of the fixed panel on each of these radio shows. And so what happened as a result of this event, of this coming together of things, is that at Stanford University Medical Center, I got permission to essentially conduct a lot of experiments to do with organizational development and to try and shift this canvas within which everything operates. And so I use the emotional intelligence tool as a way to kind of center discussions and to just give you, a quick overview of what it looks like. So you've got this emotional wheel that the software will recognize up to like 500 different emotions. And if you don't know, many times people don't know what they're feeling. They just have a sense that, hey, I don't feel good. I feel something's disturbing me. And then, so if you don't know what you're feeling, the software will ask you, hey, is this happening in your mind, in your gut, or is this you feel it physically in your body? And then it will guide you to get to potentially the emotion you're feeling. But then as a result, what you do is that, remember, all these are anonymous, so you don't know. You're sitting in a team, and you've got all these entries that have been made by members of the team. And now for the first time, you're looking at it collectively, and you're seeing, what people are feeling and why they're feeling this. So, typically it may be some project that's, central. Maybe you're creating a new hospital or something, and there's a lot of issues that come up. And so the team that's responsible for creating the hospital would all be using this tool, and then many times there's people will never say what they're actually feeling, and there'll be a lot of lip service that, hey, things are going fine. But in reality, it's not going fine. And in reality, there's stuff that's going on that can change the balance of how the organization needs to think about the future. And so this allows a kind of an objective view of all the issues, and then the team will collectively think about possible solutions. They'll take each issue. Nobody's going to ask who said that, but how can we address this? Whatever's coming up, how can we address it collectively? And then they'll also make a determination of who's empowered to solve it. And so with that, what it creates is a action plan. And then in addition, what the software will do is that based on so this is a 24/7 tool. You can access it on the web. You can access it on your Android or iPhone. And anytime you make an entry, everything's recalculated in real time. So, imagine you got a situation where you have a change in leadership in an organization, or there's some crisis that occurs, and you want to get a sense for what's happening in the organization. So if there's a leadership change, what you'll do is that the software will quickly show you, hey, that leadership change, these were the kinds of, this is the 0 line over here, and it's saying that anything in pink was negative, anything in yellow is positive. And so when that leadership change happened, then what we're seeing is that the pink became yellow. So there's a positive trend over there. So the team can now get a real-time view of, how are trends occurring, and then it'll break it up by body by heart, gut, and mind. So physically, vitally, mentally, you'll get a sense of what's shifting physically, vitally, mentally in the makeup of the organization. And that in itself is going to then allow different kinds of interventions to be thought of. And again, remember, the only reason that I'm sharing this is that it allows us to manage the canvas at the margin where change is happening, because we're all endowed with this sophisticated radar system that if we pay attention to it and if we take action based on the signals we're getting, then we can become much more aware of what the system is doing and how we need to shift and how signals in the system need to kind of be leveraged in particular ways and how others need to be ignored. Now, for instance, in a typical organization and a typical team, and many of you may have experienced this, is that many times the team will become subject to negativity. So if there's fear or if there's anger, it'll continue unendingly. And so, what you want to do is that the software will show the team in real time to what degree the negative stuff is becoming positive. So the team now has a mirror that is telling the team that you're doing the right thing or you're not doing the right thing, because whatever you're experiencing, the negative stuff you're experiencing continues to be experienced. And so these organizational metrics give you a quick sense of that, and it'll give you a sense of to what degree are constructive solutions being proposed. And again, it's allowing you then to manage the canvas much more accurately and practically. And then based on the metrics that were calculated, it'll come up with customized guidance that each team should think about. And here there's a theoretical basis that's been used to look at, okay, what are the range of organizational dynamic issues that you need to address in real time in order to move from a state of dysfunction to function. So that's part of what sets up the guidance. And then you get a quick snapshot of, here you got like 30 teams, and you can see you want to be in the green zone. So that's ideally, that means you've got low entropy as an organization. That means your system canvas is working well. But in reality, you may find that very, very few teams are operating there. And this is very typical in all the organizations I work, because most organizations will be out of the scope of what's desired and will be operating more on the fringes. So it means there's a lot of work that needs to be done to get the organization to where it really needs to go. Now, so that's managing at the margin. And I just want to make a reality check. How are we doing on time? 34 minutes. Okay. So let me accelerate a little bit. So here, tapping into deeper possibilities for power within, because to the degree that this canvas can be managed in real time, then if there's deeper patterns that exist in the system or in individuals that get into that realm of the powers that exist deeply in a system itself or deeply in an individual, those have a chance of coming out. And here, I want to mention a very interesting story. So I was doing some work for Zappos. I was a consultant for a few years, and I used to work for the chief operating officer. And one of the things he asked me to do was come up with a simulation for how culture is connected to business value. And so I created this simulation, and I had something called X factor over there. You could see it. And he really liked the simulation. He told me to come to the next executive meeting with all the executive members. And he said, whatever you do, don't talk about the X factor. Okay, so that was kind of his guidance to me. And he says, another thing, keep it capped to 15 minutes. Now, I was also advised that, Tony Hsieh, who was the CEO at that time, I was advised, he's going to be looking at his computer the whole time. He won't look up. He won't ask you a single question. And that's just the way he is. Well, I went into the meeting, and what happened was that before I knew it, when he saw X factor, he got up, walked in front of the room and said, what's X factor? And so the exact things I was told not to do, I suddenly had to go into. And so we spent 1 hour going into X factor. And X factor, we can think about it essentially as the fourfold powers. And the way, this is the exact slide I used to, to explain it to him. So I threw it up on part of the presentation, and I wanted to use a scientific basis. So I said, okay, let's think about the makeup of the cellular level. And it's a known fact that there's 4 molecular plans in any cell. And these are nucleic acids, proteins, polysaccharides, lipids. But if you ask, what's the organizational principle that animates these molecular plans, you can see that nucleic acids has something to do with the thing you call knowledge, and proteins has something to do with service and presence, and polysaccharides that provides energy to the cell has something to do with power, and lipids has something to do with harmony. And so, after going through this whole discussion on how nature, 30 orders of magnitude from the invisible to the cell, is organized using these fourfold powers, which we can see exist at the atomic level, exist at the quantum level, exist at the field level. And so it stands to reason that any organization that wants to be successful also needs to organize itself by these 4 powers. And so he got very interested in that. And so next thing I knew, I was a part of all these committees, and he created a new team that I was a center of, and I was a consultant. And there was a lot of, I would say, there were people who didn't want me to be where I was, or to have to be able to influence things in this way. But it still happened, and so what, let me move forward, and essentially, very interestingly, even in a study done by Fortune, just a couple of years before I gave this whole presentation and had the interaction with Tony Shea, there was basically of some top organizations in which Zappos was included as well, that had very admired cultures. And there was Build-A-Bear, there was Whole Food Markets, there was Zappos at that time. And as I studied the core values that drove the organization, I could actually break it up into knowledge, presence, power, and harmony. And when I looked at the core values of companies that weren't doing so well, I found that they were all kind of heavy in either knowledge or presence or typically power, and nothing else. There was never any balance. So again, this kind of collectively helped move the needle at Zappos to say, hey, this is something important. So we began some experiments at Zappos as well. And I'll say one had to do with neuroplasticity. And essentially, the whole idea was to legitimately to introduce new language into the organization. And here, if you read these, you'll recognize that I used language from Synthesis of Yoga and from the book The Mother, and I introduced it into Zappos, to just think about these 4 powers. So how, for example, the study of life in areas outside the domain of work, we know if somebody's interested in that. And I call these instincts, but I said that, hey, if that's what drives you, then we know you have an interest in knowledge, or you're probably aligned with this thing that we call knowledge. And a power of enjoyment, if that's something important to you, again, that's a phrase from The Mother, the book, Sri Aurobindo's book, The Mother. But if that's something that somebody selects as important to them, that the power of harmony or mutuality is very important. And so I created another software tool that essentially could be used by teams, individuals and teams. And so, it ended up that, as new hires came into the organization, they all did this tool. So we kind of got a profile of, how people are balanced, along power, presence, knowledge, harmony. And then also the kind of insight it gives, practical insight to manage the canvas better, is that we found certain departments where knowledge was the most important thing, and nothing else mattered. So there was a complete lopsidedness, which means that if push comes to shove, and if the situation changes, then all of a sudden you're going to get compromised, because you can't think differently, you can't act differently, you're always thinking the same way. And so this was practically what how this got rolled out in the organization. And of course, as we look at different departments and organizations, there's biases. Research and development, we would expect, would be more knowledge, wisdom oriented. Sales and marketing would be more power, leadership oriented, and so on. But what we try to do was say, hey, ideally, given the market that we're going into, how do we want to think about what's important? And so there was different kind of DNAs that were created for, okay, for this team needs to act like this and so on. And so then you could do a gap analysis using the software and figure out, okay, how do you need to change, what skills you need to build up, what instincts you need to build up and so on. So, this became an approach to create based on powers within. And I'm going to accelerate, I think, I don't have a lot of time, but let me try and wrap up as much as possible. So the next thing is keeping, things vitally alive. And I'm going to go through this really fast, but here I used essentially to understand markets, use the four powers again. So, so imagine you've got a system or a market, a very practical market. And so you can think about, I've just used codes over here, but think about, okay, knowledge and power, how does that show up in the market? Service, how does it show up? Mutuality, how does that show up? Power positioning, how does it show up? And so you can create some kind of scheme by which you're understanding the market in terms of these four powers and perfection, how does it show up? And now to make it practical, you can translate, and this is what I did at Zappos, but essentially, it had hundreds of thousands of products that it was selling, and it was operating in different markets, and it was operating through different channels. So essentially, I just mapped the way it was operating to these four powers, to combinations of these four powers to understand, to get more insight into the dynamics of the market that was animating, what Zappos was working in. And then, the market, because there's many different ways in which all these sub-elements can connect, it becomes impossibly complex, really fast. And to give you an idea, because there's all kinds of connections and possibilities. And the way that using systems thinking that you kind of managed this impossibility was, and this was very practical, and it drove, huge profitability in the organization. But I used to run the pricing department for Zappos for a couple of years, and this is what we did. Essentially, we would create rules, different kinds of rules. We didn't know how the market was going to change. You didn't know that. You never knew that, because there's always new stuff coming in every day. The system is continually changing. But what you try to do was just come up with different experiments that connected different elements together, and you ran those experiments and see how the market reacted to them. And so that's essentially how. So using these four powers and diversifying them into different elements and connecting them, we were able to drive a very substantial additional profit as a result of it. So this becomes kind of a way to think about, vitally, how do you keep things alive? And then, but the complexity of managing a system is huge. You never know. There's all kinds of organizational issues. There's a lot of dysfunctions. There's markets that can change, and so this is where I introduced the idea of light. And so I'm not going to go into the theory because we don't have time, but essentially the cosmology of light is based on thinking about light that operates at different speeds and the realities it creates. And there's two speeds here. One is where we hypothetically think of it moving infinitely fast, and then we think of it as moving at 186,000 miles per second. That we know is it's what it travels at in vacuum. And then so what I used to do is I began to have workshops within Zappos, and we conducted hundreds of workshops, especially during COVID, where everybody would get introduced to this idea of light. And bottom line is that there would be two exercises that many people would do. One was, if you got a problem, just take your light sphere. You've got a personal light sphere. First of all, work it, expand it out, and then engulf whatever problem you have. Or if you got a market issue and you don't know what to do in the market, just engulf the market in it and begin to subject it to light in a sense, and then begin to see things in dual vision. So, practically you see something with your physical eyes, and then intuitively you can see it with your mind's eye using light. And this remains completely theoretical until it becomes practical. And it's just that circumstance was such that it became very practical, because with COVID, there was a real appetite to do this kind of stuff. And then what happened was that I also entered into, I used to write regularly for Forbes. And so I wrote a few articles on light, which also was well received. And that led to a whole different program that 250 companies participated in, including the light segment. So, how do you think about the system canvas and how do you change the system canvas using your systems thinking, using emotional intelligence, and using light? That's basically the three components to this. But the whole idea is that when you can take things that seem impossible, subject them to light, and in a sense, see what shifts in yourself. And then I used to ask people to run very practical experiments that, hey, take something and don't use light, and take something and use light, and see practically how those evolve differently over the next 2 months. And so it becomes scientifically, you then have some kind of data to suggest to yourself whether light works or not. So that's the idea. And I'm going to just rush through this, but in the idea of coming up with the future enterprise, there's mathematical modeling that in my mind needs to be done. And so the 10 books that I wrote, actually, this is the essence of the mathematical model. But essentially what it's saying is that there's many different sources of innovation. So we have the presence, power, knowledge, harmony, but depending on the level we open to, the nature of presence, power, knowledge, harmony changes. And so the sources of innovation can change practically. We would see, if we are able to open to a deeper source of inspiration, then we can see practically how that would change the way the organization is working. And so that's kind of like the time dimension. And just moving forward, then all the tools that I introduced, all need to kind of be retrofitted or need to be able to change the mathematics of organization. And so that's essentially what I did, was that all the tools kind of were based on this math. And so then you had a set of tools that you could see, quote unquote, mathematically, how close are you to functioning as a organic, freely flowing system or not, so that becomes much more practical. And so that's the sixth point, is that you can use the mathematics to create different tools, and that's the idea of it. But essentially, I just whatever work that I've done in the last few years, I've tried to record all of it on Forbes. So there's been 2 series of Forbes articles. It's about 20 articles or so that have captured the essence of the work and the essential modeling and approach that has been used practically at Zappos. And now I'm working at a Fortune 50 company, but there as well, we're doing some things that are similar to really get to this enterprise of the future. And it's using a radically different approach than you're taught in business school, essentially to try and come up with something that is inspired by the individuality and the powers that exist within the individual, and trying to manage in real time the canvas so that none of those powers get subdued unnecessarily, so that you have scope and you have a chance for true creativity to arise in kind of like a more systematic way. And that's the whole point of these whole programs. And just to summarize, again, I'll go back to, without a doubt, Savitri has played a key part in all the work I've done in the last 30 years. It's helped me create this canvas. Very interestingly, my movement through life, which I only see retrospectively, has in fact been such that life has made me interact with some of these components that I theoretically laid out in a model 20 years before, but now practically it's beginning to practically the 20 years have kind of gone through different components of the model. And essentially this is a practical approach that can be applied at the level of individual, team, or organization. So with that, let me wrap it up.